How long could an advanced persistent threat, an APT, live in your network right now if you didn't know exactly what to look for?
Oh, that is a heavy question right out of the gate.
Right. But seriously, I want everyone listening to just think about that for a second. Just pause and imagine a highly sophisticated adversary, quietly camping out in your
Just
infrastructure.
watching. Yep.
Yeah, just watching your data flows. They are learning your admin scheduling patterns. They are mapping your Active Directory. And all of this is happening while you sip your morning coffee, looking at your screens, thinking that green dashboard actually means something.
It's the absolute nightmare scenario, isn't it? And frankly, if we look at the telemetry from recent incident response engagements across the industry, the answer for a lot of organizations isn't, it's not days.
No, definitely not days.
Right, it's months. Sometimes it's well over a year of dwell time before they even get discovered.
Which is just wild to me. I mean, look at the current news right now. We are seeing this relentless explosion of AI agents. You've got like agentic AI and co-pilots completely transforming how businesses operate.
Oh, absolutely. The automation is everywhere.
And that opens up entirely new, highly automated attack surfaces. Then you throw in the recent high-profile supply chain breaches, the ones that have everyone from the boardroom down to the server room absolutely scrambling.
Yeah, the panic is real right now.
It really is. And add in the new demands from cyber insurance policies where you literally have to mathematically prove your security posture just to get underwritten. It's a lot.
It's an overwhelming amount of pressure.
So before we get into the weeds, I really just want to take a quick moment to express some genuine empathy for you. The security pros, the cloud architects, the auditors, and the GRC analysts who are listening to this deep dive right now.
Yeah, we feel it too.
It is exhausting. You are constantly putting out fires. You're dealing with the blurring lines between data privacy and hardcore cybersecurity, and you're just trying to keep your head above water. It feels like the goalposts are strapped to a rocket.
They really are. I mean, the perimeter is gone, the data is everywhere, and the adversaries are incredibly well-funded.
Yeah.
We just can't keep applying 2015 methodologies to 2026 problems.
No, we definitely can't.
The traditional, build a high wall and monitor the gate approach, it's functionally obsolete in a distributed cloud environment. We need a fundamental architectural shift.
Which brings us to the actual mission of today's deep dive. We are taking a hard look at the gold standard of defense, which is NIST Special Publication 853 Revision 5. But we are looking at it alongside the highly anticipated NIST Privacy Framework 1.1 draft.
Yes, the convergence of those two is huge.
Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. NIST documents are these massive, dry, frankly boring walls of text.
So they definitely can be.
But our goal today is to tear down that wall. We are going to extract the most aggressive modern defense strategies from this research. We're talking non-persistence, concealment, dynamic reconfiguration, and automated compliance.
The real actionable stuff.
Exactly. We want to pull out the mechanisms you can actually use in the real world to protect your organization.
And we really need to focus on the how and the why today. Because it's one thing to just read a control about data minimization, right?
Right.
But it's another thing entirely to understand how that actually changes the way a DevOps engineer builds a data pipeline in AWS or Azure.
Yeah, theory versus practice. So let's jump straight into the deep end here. Let's talk about this foundational shift and how the industry is handling the threat landscape, because there's been a massive convergence.
Oh, massive.
For those of us who have the scars from dealing with older NIST iterations, and I'm looking specifically at Rev 4, we remember Appendix J.
Oh, good old Appendix J.
Right. And just a quick host note for the listeners. Appendix J refers to this old section of NIST 853 Rev 4, where privacy controls were basically quarantined. It was this little isolated zone at the very back of the document where they shoved everything related to privacy.
It really was.
It felt like an afterthought. Just, oh, by the way, try not to lose the customer's social security number. But Rev 5 killed Appendix J entirely, didn't it?
It did, and honestly, the death of Appendix J is probably one of the most significant philosophical shifts in modern governance. Think about why it was separated in the first place.
It was just a legal thing.
Exactly. Historically, privacy was viewed purely as a legal and compliance issue. It was a paper exercise. The lawyers drafted a privacy policy, they slapped it on the footer of the website, and the security engineers went right back to configuring firewalls, completely disconnected from what the data actually was.
Because the engineers didn't care whose data it was, right? They just cared that the database didn't fall over or get dumped to paste a bin.
Exactly that. But the new research in Rev 5 recognizes that you cannot have privacy without security. And even more importantly, Security controls themselves can violate privacy if they're not designed correctly.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
So they pulled privacy into the main house. It's deeply integrated as a core family of controls right alongside access control and incident response.
So it's front and center now.
Yes. And this is further solidified by the NIST Privacy Framework 1.1 draft, which explicitly aligns with the Cybersecurity Framework CSF 2.0.
And the research outlines that familiar structure, right? Like
Yeah.
identify P, govern P, control P, communicate P, and protect P, with the P obviously distinguishing it from the security side of things.
That's right. The structure mirrors the CSF to make it actionable.
But wait, hold on. Are you saying we can't just treat privacy as a legal checkbox anymore? Like my cloud architects actually have to build privacy into the architecture.
That is the crucial takeaway here. Privacy is no longer just a legal hurdle you jump over once a year. It is a hardcore engineering problem. The framework demands that privacy considerations are baked into the system development lifecycle from day one.
Baked in, not bolted on.
Exactly. And the research introduces a very specific technical concept to achieve this, which is disassociability.
Disassociability, okay, that's a bit of a mouthful.
It is a bit clunky to say, yeah.
So how does the framework define that? And more importantly, how does an engineer actually build it? Because theory is great, but my engineers need to write code.
So the formal definition revolves around enabling the processing of personally identifiable information, or PII, without associating it to individuals or devices beyond the strict, immediate operational requirements of the system.
Okay, that's the NIST definition.
Right, but let's look at the actual mechanism. How do you build that? It means you aren't just dumping raw customer data into a massive data lake where literally any data scientist with read access can see names, emails, and purchase histories all perfectly linked together.
So we're talking about things like tokenization and data masking at the pipeline level, right?
Yes, absolutely. And dynamic salting and hashing. Let's say you have a microservice that analyzes user behavior to generate product recommendations.
Okay, pretty standard e-commerce setup.
Right. That service needs to know what products were clicked, sure, but it does not need to know the user's real name or their home address. Disassociability dictates that the data pipeline strips those identifiers and replaces them with a cryptographic token before the recommendation engine ever even sees it.
I see. So if that specific microservice gets compromised, say an attacker exploits a zero-day in a logging library and dumps the memory, they get a bunch of useless hash tokens instead of a goldmine of PII.
Exactly. You are reducing the blast radius by mathematically severing the tie between the human and the data the very moment the identity is no longer functionally required.
That's powerful.
It is, but it requires a very deep understanding of your data flows. You can't just guess where the data is going.
Let me try to wrap an analogy around this just to make sure I'm getting it. In the old days, security was just the bouncer at the club keeping the bad guys out, right? Checking IDs, looking for weapons, guarding the doors.
Right, the perimeter model.
And privacy was just the guest list. And the VIP rules, making sure the people inside are only doing what they're explicitly allowed to do. But with disassociability, it's more like, well, you go to the club, the bouncer takes your ID, verifies you are over 21, and hands you a blank wristband with a barcode.
Oh, I like where this is going.
So when you go to the bar, the bartender scans the barcode. The system tells the bartender, yes, legal to drink, but the bartender never knows your name, your address, or your birthday. The system disassociates your identity from your authorization.
I really like that analogy, but let's push it a bit further to explain the actual mechanism under the hood. Because in a modern cloud environment, that barcode is governed by something like attribute-based access control or ABAC.
ABAC, right.
The bartender, which in our case is the microservice, is querying a centralized policy engine. The policy engine evaluates the attributes of the request against the governance rules established in the Control P phase of the framework.
Ah, tying it back to the framework.
Exactly. It ensures the data is only handled exactly as the user consented to, and not a single bit more.
Which means privacy and security teams can't be at each other's throats anymore. They literally have to sit at the same table and design that ABAC architecture together.
They absolutely do.
But here's the immediate pushback you're going to get from any engineer listening right now. If we are forcing security and privacy to be this deeply intertwined at the granular architectural level, isn't this going to drown us in complexity?
That is always the fear.
I mean, when people hear NIST 853, they immediately think of this impossible mountain of controls that's just going to gridlock their sprint cycles forever.
And it's a completely valid fear. The sheer volume of the catalog is intimidating. There's no denying that. The research breaks down the control baselines by impact level.
Walk us through those numbers really quick.
Sure. So you have the low impact baseline with 149 controls. The moderate baseline jumps to 287, and high goes all the way up to 370 controls. And keep in mind, that's just the baseline before you even start tailoring.
Yeah, and let's be real here. For most of the intermediate security pros tuning in, if you are working in fintech, healthcare, or government contracting, you are living in that moderate to high tier.
Almost certainly, yes.
So trying to implement 300-plus controls sounds like an absolute nightmare of complexity.
It really does, which is why one of the most fascinating parts of the research is how NIST actually addresses this very problem. In the System and Services Acquisition family, specifically the engineering principles in SA8, there is a control, SA87, that explicitly mandates the principle of reduced complexity.
Okay, wait. I have to laugh at that. You're telling me NIST, the undisputed king of massive, hundreds of pages long government documentation, actually has a control mandating reduced complexity.
I know, the irony is thick.
How do they even justify that without winking at the camera?
It does sound like a paradox, but it's actually deeply pragmatic engineering. Think about cyclomatic complexity in software development.
Okay, yeah, the number of paths through a piece of code.
Right. The more paths your code can take, the harder it is to test, and the more likely it is to contain a vulnerability. The exact same principle applies to system architecture.
Oh, I see.
SA87 states that assisted design should be as simple and small as possible. A simple architecture is inherently more analyzable. If you have this convoluted, monolithic application with a giant spaghetti bowl of network dependencies, you literally cannot see the holes in your own defenses.
So if an attacker drops a web shell somewhere deep in that monolith, it just gets lost in the noise of a million other poorly configured connections.
Exactly, it just blends in. The simpler the system, the easier it is to verify that the security policy has actually been captured in the design. And NIST couples this with another principle, SA827, which is human-factored security.
Human-factored security.
Yeah.
Is that about not making the user's life miserable? Because I feel like security has a long history of making user experience an absolute afterthought.
It is entirely about that. It's the formal recognition that security mechanisms shouldn't degrade user efficiency. The interface for security functions needs to be intuitive.
Because if a DevOps engineer has to jump through 10 burning hoops, wait for 3 different approval tickets, and use a clunky VPN just to push a critical patch to a staging environment, they aren't going to do it the right way.
No, they are going to find a shortcut.
Right. They're going to spin up a shadow IT environment or leave an SSH port open to the internet just to bypass the friction.
And we see that all the time in incident response. The breach didn't happen because the cryptography failed, you know? The breach happened because the security process was so painful that a smart engineer found a dangerous workaround.
That is so true.
Human-factored security means designing systems where doing the secure thing is intrinsically the easiest thing to do. If you want developers to use secure authentication, you don't make them rotate complex passwords every 30 days.
Which everyone hates.
Right. Instead, you issue them a hardware biometric key, like a YubiKey, and make authentication a seamless tap. You make security invisible.
I think everyone listening can relate to the pain of overly complex legacy IAM systems. You know, identity and access management systems where a new hire takes 3 weeks to get the right permissions, and in the meantime, they're just borrowing a coworker's credentials just to read the internal wiki.
It's a classic anti-pattern.
So how does a cloud architect actually build this simplicity? What's the structural approach recommended in the research?
The research highlights the principle of modularity and layering, which is SA83. This is where we get into the actual architecture. It means isolating functions into well-defined logical units.
Break that down for us. How does modularity and layering look in, say, a standard AWS environment?
Well, in a cloud-native environment, modularity means you don't put your web front end, your application logic, and your database in the same massive virtual private cloud subnet with flat routing.
Right. No flat networks.
You use microservices, you segment the network, you physically and logically isolate the command and control functions from the main application.
So you are layering the defenses like watertight compartments on a submarine.
Yes, exactly. If an adversary exploits a SQL injection in your web tier, they shouldn't suddenly have a clear line of sight to the IAM management console. They should hit a strict network boundary, a different identity perimeter, and a different set of logging
They
alerts.
hit a wall.
Right. You isolate the components so that a failure in one module doesn't compromise the trustworthiness of the entire system.
Okay, so let's say we've done the hard work here. We've built a system that is modular. The complexity is heavily reduced. The privacy is baked in via disassociability. And the developers actually like using it because of human factor design.
A beautiful scenario.
It is. But we know the bad guys are still coming, especially the sophisticated ones. I want to shift now into the highly technical, aggressive defense tactics outlined in the framework. Because if we built this simple modular system, how do we actively defend it against an APT?
This is where we transition from foundational architecture to active defense mechanisms. Specifically in the System and Communications Protection family, the SC controls, and the System and Information Integrity family, the SI controls.
Okay, SC and SI families.
These contain some of the most proactive, aggressive controls in row 5. I want to look really closely at SC30, which is concealment and misdirection, and SI14, which is non-persistence.
Concealment and misdirection. That sounds like high-end military cyber warfare doctrine, not standard enterprise IT. How does a regular organization actually implement that?
It actually does originate from military doctrine, specifically the concept of moving target defense. SE30 details how organizations should change processing and storage locations randomly or periodically to confuse and mislead adversaries.
Okay, but how are you actually moving the cheese in a practical sense? Because if an environment is static, like if your database always lives at 10.45.55, an APT has all the time in the world.
Exactly.
They can map it, they can study the vulnerability, write the custom exploit, and just wait for a Friday night holiday weekend to deploy it.
Right. A static infrastructure gives the adversary the asymmetric advantage of time. They have all the time, and you have none. But moving target defense flips that dynamic completely.
So in practice, how do you do it?
You use dynamic IP routing. You use ephemeral port shuffling. If you have a cluster of application servers, you don't just leave them running indefinitely for months on end.
You don't just patch them and leave them up.
No. You use infrastructure as code to tear them down and spin them up in different availability zones with entirely new internal IP addresses every few hours.
Oh, wow. So the adversary spends 3 days mapping your internal network, but by the time they actually try to move laterally, the map is completely obsolete. The server they were targeting literally doesn't exist that IP address anymore.
Precisely. You introduce uncertainty. You drastically increase the work factor for the adversary. And to figure out where your critical assets moved, what do they have to do?
They have to scan again.
Right. They have to run more scans, they have to make more DNS queries, they have to make noise. And the more noise they make, the more likely they are to trip a SOC alert.
That's brilliant.
The research even mentions using realistic but misleading information like deception nets or honey tokens to feed attackers false data about your security posture.
So you are actively laying traps. You are putting fake AWS API keys in a GitHub repository, and the very moment someone tries to use them, you know you have an intruder because no legitimate system uses those keys.
Exactly. It's a high-fidelity alert.
That's fantastic. And that leads right into SI14, non-persistence. I have to say, this might be my favorite concept in the entire framework.
Yeah.
So earlier we talked about moving target defense. SI14 is basically the ultimate form of that, right? It's like giving your orchestrator a stack of burner phones.
That's a great way to put it.
You spin up a container, you do a specific job, and then you just immediately throw the phone in the ocean.
That is the exact mechanism. The research states that non-persistent system components should be initiated in a known, trusted state and then terminated either periodically or at the end of a session.
Let's do the math on why that is so devastating to an attacker. And just a quick host note for the listeners. An APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. Usually a nation-state or a highly funded group that breaches a network and quietly camps out for months to steal data, rather than executing a quick smash-and-grab ransomware attack. They rely entirely on that middle word, persistent.
Right. The traditional APT attack lifecycle is pretty standard. They gain initial access, they establish command and control C2, they elevate their privileges, and then they establish persistence.
They drop a backdoor.
Exactly. They drop a backdoor, they modify a registry key, they hide a cron job in Linux. They want to ensure that if the server reboots, their malware automatically boots up with it. They want to sit there for months exfiltrating your data slowly.
But if the underlying infrastructure is entirely ephemeral, like If you were using Kubernetes and your pods have a maximum time to live of, say, 4 hours, or better yet, you are using serverless functions like AWS Lambda that only exist for milliseconds.
Then the math changes completely. If the container dies every few hours, the attacker's persistence dies right along with it. It turns to ash.
That is amazing.
They drop their sophisticated backdoor, they go to sleep for the night, and by the time they wake up, the container they infected has been automatically terminated and replaced by a fresh, pristine image from your verified registry. Persistence becomes mathematically impossible.
It completely destroys their window of opportunity. They are stuck in this endless, frustrating loop of having to re-exploit the initial vulnerability just to get back in. And like you said earlier, exploiting vulnerabilities makes noise, it generates logs.
It strips the adversary of their most powerful weapon, which is time. And what's truly remarkable about this is that a decade ago, rebuilding your entire server infrastructure from a golden image every hour sounded like science fiction.
Oh, people would have laughed you out of the room.
It sounded completely impossible. But today, if you are a cloud architect building a modern cloud-native application, non-persistence isn't just a security control, it's your default operational state. NIST is simply codifying modern DevOps practices as an advanced security mitigation.
So we've built this incredibly hostile environment for the attacker. The architecture is modular, the IP addresses are constantly shifting with moving target defense, the containers are dying and respawning out of pristine images.
It's a tough environment to hack.
But we can't just set it and forget it, right? We still need eyes on the glass. We have to talk about how the modern SOC, the Security Operations Center, fits into this highly automated ephemeral framework. Because traditional alert monitoring seems like it would just break in this kind of environment.
It absolutely breaks. Traditional SOC operations were built around static rules and just waiting for a SIEM, a security information and event management system, to flag a known bad hash or a known bad IP.
Right, waiting for a match.
But the incident response family in Rev 5, specifically IR14, demands something fundamentally different. It mandates the establishment of a cyber threat hunting capability.
Hold on, threat hunting. I feel like that term gets thrown around a lot by marketing vendors. What does it actually mean in the context of this specific framework? So we aren't just sitting back waiting for a SIEM alert anymore.
No, we absolutely cannot afford to wait. The psychological shift here is profound. Threat hunting operates on the assume breach mentality.
Assume they are already inside.
Yes, you have to assume that a highly sophisticated adversary is already inside your network, and they have successfully bypassed your standard antivirus and your firewall rules. Therefore, threat hunting involves proactively searching your networks, your endpoints, and your data repositories for indicators of compromise that have explicitly evaded your automated defenses.
Because if they are an APT, they aren't using off-the-shelf malware that your standard endpoint detection is going to catch.
No, they're living off the land.
Right. They're using legitimate admin tools like PowerShell or WMAMI to move laterally. So it just looks like normal admin activity.
Exactly. Threat hunters are looking for subtle anomalies. A user account that normally logs in from Chicago at 9 a.m. suddenly accessing a highly sensitive database from a weird IP address at 3 a.m. Or a sudden spike in encrypted traffic leaving a server that normally only talks to the internal network.
But here's the reality. Humans alone cannot process the sheer volume of telemetry required to spot those subtle anomalies in a modern enterprise environment.
Oh, absolutely not.
The alert fatigue is so real. I've talked to SOC analysts who just look entirely burned out. When your dashboard is flashing red with like 10,000 critical alerts a day because of purely tuned rules, everything is an emergency.
Which means nothing is an emergency.
Exactly. You just start bulk closing tickets out of sheer survival instinct. It's a miserable way to work.
And adversaries count on that alert fatigue. They hide in the noise. They know you are drowning in false positives. That's why the framework introduces RA34, which is predictive cyber analytics.
Predictive analytics. Okay, so we're talking of using AI and machine learning here, right?
Yes. The research explicitly mentions using advanced automation, analytics, and machine learning capabilities to predict and identify risks. You need machine-assisted decision tools.
How does that work in practice for the SOC analyst?
The ML algorithms ingest the massive volume of logs. They establish a baseline of normal behavior for every single user and entity in the network, and then they correlate events across different systems to spot the deviations.
So instead of a human analyst having to manually write a complex Sigma rule to try and catch a specific attack pattern, the AI bubbles up the actual highly probable complex threats that
Exactly.
says, hey, human, look at this specific chain of events. This looks like a lateral movement attempt. It's augmenting the human, not replacing them.
Exactly. It frees the human threat hunter to do what humans actually do best: apply context, intuition, and strategic thinking. But it doesn't stop at detection. When the threat hunter or the AI confirms an intrusion, the response has evolved drastically too. The framework highlights IR42, dynamic reconfiguration.
Dynamic reconfiguration. How does that play out during an active incident? Because, I mean, back in the day, incident response was literally someone running into the server room and pulling the Ethernet cable out of the wall.
It's the modern equivalent of that, but automated and instantaneous. If the SOC detects an active intrusion, say an attacker is trying to exfiltrate data from a specific subnet, the system doesn't just send an email alert to an admin who might be asleep.
That would be too close.
Way too slow. Instead, a SO platform security orchestration, automation and response, or maybe a Kubernetes admission controller can dynamically change router rules, update access control list, or null route malicious IP addresses on the fly.
So you're dynamically shifting the maze walls around the attacker in real time.
Yes. You can instantly quarantine infected virtual machines into an isolated VLAN where they can't talk to anything else, limiting the blast radius before the attacker can spread. You can revoke the compromised IAM credentials automatically. It is an incredibly aggressive, active defense posture. You are fighting the adversary at machine speed rather than waiting to read the logs the day after a breach.
It is just brilliant. Okay, so we've covered the architecture, we've covered the active defense, we've covered the AI-driven SOC. This brings us to our final major topic, and it's the one that usually makes engineers groan, but it is the most critical part of the business reality.
GRC.
Yes, governance, risk, and compliance, and specifically automation and the death of the spreadsheet. Because you have all these incredible technical controls in place, burner servers, dynamic mazes, AI threat hunters. But if a regulator knocks on your door or a major enterprise client asks for proof before they sign a multi-million-dollar contract, you have to be able to prove it.
And this is precisely where so many organizations stumble. They do the technical work, they have smart engineers, but their governance is an absolute disaster.
Right.
They can't prove their security posture without a massive manual effort. The framework heavily emphasizes continuous controls monitoring, or CCM.
Continuous, as
Yeah.
in not once a year in November when the external auditor shows up and everyone panics.
Right. We have to move away from treating privacy and security audits as point-in-time annual transactional events. The threat landscape moves way too fast, and cloud environments are too dynamic.
You can't certify a system as secure based on a screenshot taken 6 months ago.
Exactly. The research points toward a paradigm of compliance as code, and it highlights the absolute necessity of platforms and automation tools like Hyperproof, Sprinto, Security.ai, and RegScale to achieve this.
I want everyone listening to just feel this pain with me for a second, because we've all been there, right?
Well, I'm sure they know it.
It's 3 a.m. on a Thursday. You are trying to close out an audit finding. The auditor is demanding evidence of access controls from a server that was provisioned 3 years ago, and your evidence is sitting in a massive, color-coded Excel spreadsheet that hasn't been updated since the last CEO was here.
A total nightmare.
The links are broken, the screenshots are missing, and you are literally begging a grumpy sysadmin on Slack to run a script just to get a log file. It's an unsustainable nightmare.
It is entirely unsustainable, and honestly, it's a massive waste of highly paid engineering talent. That's why CCM is so critical. Modern GRC platforms integrate directly via APIs into your tech stack. They plug directly into AWS, GitHub, Okta, Jira.
So they pull the data directly.
Right. They don't ask a human for a screenshot. They constantly query the API to ensure that MFA is enforced, that encryption at rest is turned on, that vulnerabilities are being patched within your SLAs. They pull the evidence automatically and continuously.
So your Terraform state files, your AWS config logs, those become your actual real-time compliance evidence. That is a game changer for teams. But there's another element in the research that I find fascinating, especially for global organizations. Crosswalks. Why are crosswalks suddenly so vital?
Because of regulatory overlap. Let's look at the NIST Privacy Framework. In the Identify P function, you are required to map your data processing. You have to gather evidence of where personal data flows through your architecture.
Okay, standard mapping.
Now, if you are operating globally, you don't just have to comply with NIST. You have the GDPR in Europe, the CCPA in California, the VCDPA in Virginia, maybe ISO 27701.
And if you try to manage each of those frameworks in a separate silo, you're going to need an army of compliance analysts doing duplicate work.
Exactly. And that's where crosswalks come in. A crosswalk is a mapping between the controls of different
Like a
frameworks.
translation matrix.
Yes. If you use a modern GRC platform, you map your data processing evidence once to satisfy the NIST Identify P control. The platform uses a crosswalk to automatically apply that exact same piece of evidence to satisfy the CCPA's requirement for a right to opt-out mechanism and the GDPR's right to access requirement.
So you do the work once, the API pulls the evidence automatically, and the platform translates it to speak the language of 5 different regulators simultaneously.
Yes.
That is mathematically the only way a modern enterprise can scale compliance without grinding the business to a complete halt.
It is. It transforms compliance from a retroactive paperwork exercise into a real-time strategic advantage.
I want to directly address the GRC analysts and auditors listening to this right now, because sometimes when we talk about APIs and compliance as code, there's this underlying anxiety. Like, are you trying to automate me out of a job?
Which is a fair concern, but unfounded.
Right, and the answer is absolutely not. Your job isn't going away, it is evolving. It is becoming less about chasing down screenshots and nagging engineers on Slack, and much more about strategic risk intelligence.
Exactly.
When you have continuous monitoring handling all the busy work, you get to stop being a compliance cop and start being a strategic advisor to the board.
That is the ultimate goal. Utilizing the NIST frameworks to automate the evidence collection allows you to focus human intellect on actual risk management. You are analyzing the gaps, you're assessing the vendor risk, and you're steering the security culture of the organization rather than just filling out cells in a spreadsheet.
So let's bring this all together. We have gone on an incredible deep technical journey today. We started by looking at the Great Convergence, the death of Appendix J, and how Rev 5 and the Privacy Framework 1.1 demand that privacy is engineered directly into the architecture through mechanisms like disassociability and tokenization.
And we then explored how to prevent that integration from crushing the engineering teams by leaning into the principle of reduced complexity and human-factored security.
Which is huge.
We discussed how modularity and microservices make a system inherently more analyzable and defensible.
Then we got extremely aggressive. We tore into the SC and SI families. We broke down how moving target defense, ephemeral port shuffling, and non-persistent burner infrastructure like short-lived Kubernetes pods completely destroy an APT's ability to maintain a foothold.
We also recognized that active defense requires an evolved SOC. We discussed moving away from reactive alert chasing and some fatigue toward proactive cyber threat hunting augmented by predictive machine learning.
And automated dynamic reconfiguration to isolate threats at machine speed.
Exactly.
And finally, we wrapped it all up with continuous controls monitoring, API-driven evidence collection, and framework crosswalks, effectively killing the legacy compliance spreadsheet once and for all. It's not just an update to a document, it is a completely new paradigm for how we architect, defend, and govern our organizations.
It truly is. It requires a massive shift in mindset from every single person in the security organization, but it is the only way forward in the modern threat landscape.
Thanks for tuning in to InfoSec Bytes. Keep exploring our 100-plus episodes on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity, incident root cause analysis. Please like, subscribe. We are on various platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, and share to stay connected and keep your cyber defenses strong. See you in the next episode. Stay tuned.
If you had to prove to your board tomorrow that your organization is actually practicing disassociability with your customer data at the pipeline level, how confident are you that your current architecture could back you up? Go look at your data flows this week and find out.